I mean, that's what's actually taking place right before our eyes. And that's what they will persist in, unless there is a two-state settlement. And that third option, namely the one that's actually taking place, is ignored in these discussions, which makes them essentially irrelevant. We know exactly what the plans are. It's not a big secret. More or less what Prime Minister Ehud Olmert called convergence. He got a standing ovation for it when he talked about it in Congress a couple of years ago. Israel will take over everything inside the separation wall, actually an annexation wall, which includes arable land, the pleasant suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and crucially, the main water resources. A lot of Israeli settlements, this goes back to a century, are designed to make sure that Israel controls the water resources of the region. And the West Bank aquifer that Israel draws from, it's actually Palestinian, but Israel draws from it, is most of the water from it. That happens to be behind the separation wall, which is why they're putting it where it is. So Israel will take that. It'll take what's called Jerusalem, which in fact is Greater Jerusalem, a much expanded area that Israel expanded enormously after the '67 war and annexed it in violation of Security Council orders. So Israel will take that, maybe some token Palestinian presence somewhere. Israel will take over the Jordan Valley, which is again much of the arable land, and that imprisons the rest, and the rest will be broken up into Sharon's Bantustans by salients that cut through. There's a big one east of Jerusalem, cuts through the town of Ma'ale Adumim. It was planned began in the 1970s, mostly built under Clinton, and it essentially bisects the West Bank. And there's two more salients up to the north, one going through the town of Ariel, one Kadumim, and they cut up pretty much what remains. So, and there won't be any Palestinians there. Israel will take them over. No demographic problem, no civil rights struggle. Palestinians will be consigned to whatever's left. Meanwhile, Israel has finally understood that they should follow the advice of Israeli industrialists about 15 years ago. They advised that Israel should shift from, these are their words, from colonialism to neocolonialism. Well, neocolonialism is, what you've got in much of the third world. There's a sector of wealthy and privileged people who live very nicely, like Westerners, and there's a sea of misery around them. And that's what's happening. So by now, Israel is permitting, in fact, encouraging development in Ramallah, seat of the Palestinian Authority, where there are, theaters and restaurants and quite a decent life, like any third world country. And you go off into the rural areas, and it's a disaster. Now, to carry that off, you need a mailed fist. That's another aspect of the neocolonial style, and they've got it. There's an army run by a U.S. general, Keith Dayton, General Dayton, trained by the Jordanian dictatorship with the cooperation of Israel, and it's apparently pretty effective, or so the U.S. hopes. In fact, the Obama administration is very impressed with it. John Kerry, sort of point man for Obama, gave an important speech about a year ago in which he said that at last, after many years of yearning, Israel may have a legitimate negotiating partner, namely the Palestinian Authority. And as evidence, he pointed to one thing, namely during the attack on Gaza, they were anticipating some kind of protests in the West Bank, but there weren't any protests because General Dayton's army was able to suppress all protests and arrest protesters and so on. So therefore the place was under the control of a U.S., Jordanian, Israeli-run paramilitary force. So maybe that means that Israel has a legitimate negotiating partner. Well, that's the attitude of the U.S. government. John Kerry's sort of the liberal end of the government, and Obama's one of his main representatives in the area. Well, okay, that's the traditional neocolonial pattern. We see it all over the world. The U.S. instituted in the Philippines a century ago, and it's been duplicated in one or another form ever since, all over the place. So yeah, they might continue to apply that. But that's the third option, the realistic option, unless a two-state settlement is established. The one-state proposal is, Israel's not going to accept it. The U.S. is not going to accept it. There's no pressure for it in Europe. It's just a non-starter. No reason why the U.S. and Israel should accept it.
I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about the general concept of international law. If essentially it only applies to the extent a government is willing to comply with it, if it can't supersede the national law of a sovereign state, and if it isn't universally enforceable, why does it even exist?
It's a good thing that it exists. It's good for educational purposes. It's like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Like the United States, for example, formally rejects 2/3 of it, but it's still good to have it on the books. People accept it, even if governments don't. And it's a way of educating and organizing and getting people to think about compelling their governments to observe human rights. It's also used as a weapon against others, constantly. That's the negative side. And it's pretty much the same with international law. It's, of course, unenforceable, except against the weak and the defeated. And the powerful use it as a weapon for their own purposes. When you get to the powerful states, like the United States, they simply don't accept it. In fact, it's formal. Take one the United States happens to be, I think, the only country that has rejected a World Court decision. Namely, the World Court. There was Libya and Albania did too at one time, but they've since accepted them. That's the World Court decision in 1986, calling on the United States to terminate its attack on Nicaragua and pay substantial reparations. Okay, the U.S. just told them to get lost. 2 Security Council resolutions followed, calling on all states to observe international law. Thinking about this, the U.S. vetoed them. Britain and France politely abstained. The case brought by Nicaragua, which was brought by a distinguished Harvard international lawyer, was mostly thrown out by the World Court because when the U.S. accepted jurisdiction of the World Court in 1946, it added a reservation exempting the United States from any charges coming from international treaties. That meant specifically the UN Charter and the Charter of the Organization of American States. Now, under those, that's basic international law, and under those principles, the U.S. would have been charged with aggression, a much more severe crime. But the U.S. had already exempted itself from those charges, and the court, following its rules, had to keep to the charges that the states brought to the tribunal accept. In fact, the Reagan administration just rejected World Court jurisdiction altogether at that point. But the court nevertheless proceeded on very narrow grounds. In fact, a bilateral treaty between the U.S. and Nicaragua. So the court decision was limited, but nevertheless it was rejected anyway. Now, a U.S. rejection is a double veto. For one thing, first, it doesn't happen, and secondly, it's wiped out of history. So almost nobody knows about this except a few legal specialists. Well, that's the way it is with international law. I mean, under international law, everything that the U.S. and Israel are doing in the occupied territories is a crime. It's not really in question that the Geneva Conventions apply, and the Geneva Conventions expressly exclude any transfer of population to the occupied territories.